You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and I am here with a horrifying case out of Canada. And it's actually been fairly surreal writing and recording this episode as news broke this evening of the leaked draft document written by Justice Samuel Alito from the United States Supreme Court. If you guys have been following this breaking news, it's absolutely terrifying, but it does suggest that the Supreme Court will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. If you're not familiar for some reason, or our international listeners, Roe v. Wade is the landmark case in our country that made abortion legal nationwide. And by abortion, I mean women's health care. This is absolutely devastating news. It's not news that I think many of us really anticipated, and it's kind of surreal recording this episode as this news broke. The episode tonight is going to be about the Butterbox Babies out of Canada. And this is a case that I wasn't familiar with until I ran across it somewhat recently. And it's been stuck in my psyche. It's one of those cases that's just so disturbing, so horrible, couldn't shake it, had to talk about it. So before we get into that, let's just get our quick housekeeping out of the way. First, you can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find us across all social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or you can just look up We Saw the Devil. Also on our website, you can find our Patreon or go to patreon.com/We Saw the Devil, where for as little as $3 a month, you can financially back the show and become part of the team with a private Facebook group, private Discord channel, and so forth. And last but not least, guys, if you're enjoying the show, and this goes out not just for my podcast, but to any others that you may listen to, if you're loving a show, leave a review. So if you wouldn't mind and you're liking the show, head over to iTunes and leave that 5-star review. It means the world to us and actually makes a huge difference on the administrative side of things. So let's go ahead and get into this case. Imagine for a moment that you grow up with no physical similarities to your family whatsoever. Their skin is olive brown, yours is pale white. They have dark eyes, dark hair, and you have blonde hair, blue eyes, and look like you could be out of a Finnish magazine. That's what happened to Riva Barnett Saya of Union Township, New Jersey. When she was around 10 years old, her parents gave her the book The Chosen Baby, which is a popular children's book about adoption. You are special, her parents told her. You are ours. And even though Riva's parents gave her unlimited amounts of reassurance, compassion, and love, she always felt alienated, like she didn't belong, like she didn't know her history. And when I read Riva's interview and others related to this case, it resonated really deeply and intimately with me. I was personally adopted at 2 weeks old, and even though I too had really amazing parents who were my parents, they adopted me at 2 weeks, they were my parents. I grew up very privileged. I also never felt that I belonged. I inherently felt that I didn't belong, and it's a very real feeling. Well, for Riva, in 1992, a book titled The Butterbox Babies was released. And it kind of took North America by storm because it covered such a heinous topic. Written by Bette Cahill, it tells the horrific story of the Ideal Maternity Home, which was founded by husband and wife couple William P. Young and his wife Lila. Strap in for this one. Lila Gladys Young was born in 1899 to Salem and Bessie Coolin. The family was devout in their Seventh-day Adventist faith, and Lila was a very mindful child. Like many women at the time, she wanted to become a teacher, so she went to a finishing school and then taught in Fox Point, Nova Scotia. At age 26, while teaching, Lila met a 25-year-old unordained Seventh-day Adventist minister by the name of William Peach Young. William had come from Oregon with dreams of becoming a traveling medical missionary. He had graduated from the Medical Evangelist College in 1923, a couple years before, and was taking on light missionary work on the South Shore in Nova Scotia. That basically involved more or less caring for the sick and giving medical advice while also preaching the gospel. The pair immediately headed off and decided to get married. Shortly thereafter, in December of 1925, Ylana became pregnant with her first of an eventual 5 children, and then the couple decided to move to Chicago. Both Ylana and William enrolled in Chicago medical colleges, and they each graduated in 1927. William from the National College of Chiropractic, and Ylana from the National School of Obstetrics and Midwifery. Now, Nova Scotia was Ylana's home, and both she and William missed it terribly. I don't know how many of you guys have been to Nova Scotia, but it's pretty beautiful up there. They felt more comfortable there, being devout in their Seventh-day Adventist faith. They had a community there. So they packed it up and moved back in February of 1928. And they had a little bit of cash saved. So with that, they purchased a 4-bedroom cottage in Eastchester. Then they came up with an idea. They would use their medical training to open up a maternity home. And so they did. The Life and Health Sanitarium opened in 1928 with a tagline, "Where the sick get well." It was really tight on their finances, and they actually had to finance 2 of the 4 cots for the patients to sleep on. Ylana immediately began delivering babies using her obstetrics training, and within a year, they were solely specializing in maternity services, primarily for underprivileged or unwed mothers. Ylana delivered the babies, while William sat at the bedside in loud prayer. In their letterhead, they both claimed to be doctors, lending a sense of legitimacy to their facility. And business was booming. And then the home became known as the Ideal Maternity Home and Sanitarium. William was the superintendent and Ylana the director. William and Ylana would put out newspaper ads advertising the home. They read, "Ideal Maternity Home, Mother's Refuge, also Department for Girls. No publicity. Infants Home and Connection. Right for Literature. Eastchester, Nova Scotia. Brochures for the home promised to shield expectant mothers from gossip, but every service has its price." And price it definitely had. Every single thing in the Young's maternity home had a price. I mean, it was like a fucked up a la carte menu at a Michelin restaurant. So keep in mind, guys, that at this time, in early mid-1930s, the average pay in that area was $8 a week. The Ideal Maternity Home's prices were as follows: $100 to $500 for room and board, delivery, and adoption of the baby. That fee was paid on arrival. So a pregnant mother would arrive and they would put down, say, $500, and that would include room, board, delivery, and adoption of their child. An additional $12 for baby clothes. Babysitting service of $2 per week before the child is adopted or goes home with the mother. A $20 burial fee if the baby dies. That breaks down to $3 for the burial shroud, $15 for the Youngs, and $2 for a butter box. Now, let's talk about butter boxes. A butter box was a wooden box, usually made from white pine, and it was used by local dairies and creameries during the first half of the 20th century, particularly in Nova Scotia, although they were widely used. They used it to house butter and other perishable items. They were 22 inches long, 10 inches wide, and 10 inches deep. Basically, they were the perfect size for the corpse of a newborn baby. The unwed mothers would sign lengthy and confusing contracts, which were legally binding, by the way, that gave William the power of attorney and legal authority over the babies and their adoptions. If the mothers chose not to sign the contracts within 14 days of the birth, they were charged an additional $30. By the time the girls left the home, their bills often exceeded $300 to $500. Again, average wages at the time totaled around $8 per week. Sales clerks at $8 a week, domestic workers, the house cleaners, things like that, $4 a week. That's a lot of weeks and time to be able to save that much. That gave the Youngs a very steady stream of domestic help in the facility at basically zero cost. They still charged the women room and board at a reduced rate along with a work wage. They were barely even different figures, so it took them forever to work it off. And here's the thing too. The facility was not sanitary. Between 1928 and 1935, Ylana Young publicly reported 148 births and 12 infant deaths. That's a mortality rate of 8.1%, which is triple that of Nova Scotia's 3.1 average at the time. And that's what was publicly reported. There were no doctors or nurses on staff, and nothing was ever sanitized or cleaned beyond just like a rag and water. It was just Lila and William plus the staff of more or less indentured servants that they had collected from unpaid bills. But it gets worse. At the time, Nova Scotia was a huge vacation spot for New York and New Jersey residents. A large number of wealthy Jewish people in particular would travel to the area. And at this time, both the US and Canada had adoption rules that stated that children must be placed with a family of the same religious background. That was difficult for childless Jewish couples, and Jewish adoption agencies in New York and the surrounding states had waiting lists extending years. So Lila and William Young were willing to disregard that rule, and they made a killing off of it, quite literally, no pun intended. Depending on the physical characteristics of the babies, they were sold for between $1,000 and $10,000 each. And not only that, but the adopting couple was expected to give a large tip on top of it for, convenience and overlooking the law of the land. During the time that the home operated, they placed 700 or so children up for adoption. That's public records. That's not off the books, black market, private. That's public knowledge. So the children were sold between $1,000 and $10,000 each. Let's bring that average sale down to $5,000, like the average. That's $3.5 million over less than 10 years. With inflation, that's the equivalent of $60 million by today's standards. So like 1936, 1938, $60 million. During this time, both abortion and birth control were illegal. Not only that, but being an unwed or unmarried mother and having a child was more than frowned upon. It was life-ruining. You would be shunned by society. To many Canadian women, they had no other options available to them. And the Youngs knew their targeted demographic. And one ad for the home read, quote, "Dame Gossip has sent many young lives to perdition after ruining them socially. That might have been bright stars in society and a power in the world of usefulness, had they been shielded from gossip when they made a mistake." As you can imagine, a lot of women who were in that particular situation saw that ad and saw hope. And then the Youngs realized that the black market adoption business was their path forward. They would bring in potential adoptive families who were looking for a baby. They would line up rows and rows of babies in bassinets and allow them to pick one, each having a different price based on background, ethnicity, and physical characteristics. They would also mix the babies up, the ones who are available for adoption, with the babies who are being boarded while their mothers recovered from childbirth, even though that mother fully had the intention of taking her baby home with her. If they sold that baby, they would then just simply tell the mother that her baby had died. If the mother's already poor health began to decline, they would then charge her high rates for food, lodging, and board or medicine during her recovery and end up turning her into a servant to pay off the bill. As we know, not every child is born free from medical conditions, birthmarks, and things like that. So the Youngs promised pregnant mothers the following, quote, "If we are unable to find a home for the child, we will maintain it for the rest of its natural life for the remarkably small cost of $300, provided the child is white and is not birthmarked, crippled, or deformed." Needless to say, this is an outstanding offer. The mothers would pay $100 to $500 for room and board and then the delivery, then $300 to the Youngs if it was not adopted. Except plot twist. The Youngs did not, in fact, take care of those babies for the rest of their natural lives. Witnesses would later claim that between 400 to 600 babies were deliberately killed by starvation or were deliberately refused medical care because they appeared, quote, unmarketable. Again, between 400 and 600 children were deliberately murdered because they didn't think they could sell them. Sick newborns, or those who were disabled, deformed, or biracial, were murdered. The Youngs gave them molasses and water until they starved to death. The author of the Butterbox Babies, Betty Cahill, is a well-known Canadian journalist. While she was researching her book, a former caretaker at the home later admitted he was paid to bury these babies in open graves or in butter boxes from the local Le Havre dairy. If the Youngs didn't have butter boxes at their immediate disposal, they would either incinerate the bodies in their furnace or give them to local fishermen for use as bait or to bury them at sea. And yes, you heard that right. By 1933, the Nova Scotia Child Welfare Director and Health Minister, Dr. Frank Roy Davis, learned about the home when the Liberal Party came into power. And he was disturbed that they had no actual doctor or nurse on staff on the premises. There were also rumors beginning to circulate that babies were dying and disappearing at the Ideal Maternity Home. He forced them to hire a registered nurse. Not only that, but he would obsessively investigate them for the next 15 years. In 1936, a woman named Ava Nayforth and her child died at the home. Lila and William were arraigned on 2 counts of manslaughter for their deaths, but they somehow won the case. However, this just reestablished and furthered Roy Davis's interest in investigating the home, and he asked the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to officially open an investigation into all of the deaths of the facility. Inspectors found squalid conditions, like swarming flies, filthy feces and blood-soaked bedding. Some babies weighed less than half of the weight that they should have weighed. Which babies would those be, you might ask? The, quote, unremarkable ones, who typically ended up in the Butterboxes. Lila and William were charged with fraud and a variety of crimes, but nothing would stick. And why wouldn't these charges stick, might you ask? Well, here's why. Many of the prominent people in Canada had used their services. You know the joke in American politics about how Republicans are always so anti-abortion, but will then spend the money to send their wives and daughters for abortions as needed to places where it's legal? It was pretty much like that. On the front end, they were, abortion is evil, abortion is against God, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, if their, say, daughter got pregnant, they would send them to the home with William and Lila. That's where they would send their wives and daughters. That's because William and Lila offered anonymity from a society that was disgusted by female sexuality. Sign of the times. So a lot of the elite people had used their services, and they had been allowed to operate without a license since their founding 17 years prior on a legal loophole. But Roy Davis wasn't finished. He was like the Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, and William and Lila were Laurie Strode. I mean, Roy Davis just kept coming at them. And since he couldn't get criminal convictions or charges to stick, he decided to wholly amend the Maternity Boarding House Act, which gave no exceptions to licensure. William and Lila applied for a license and had to wait almost a year. Now, during this rough time frame between, say, like 1938 and 1943, the Youngs were incredibly wealthy. They bought cars, huge plots of land, the finest clothing. They expanded and expanded that original cottage that they started out with back in 1928. When they bought it, it was a 4-bedroom cottage. Now it's a massive facility with 54 rooms, 14 bathrooms. It almost looked Tudor-esque with stone turrets and large lawns and green beltways. Not only that, but they owned it outright because they had paid off their mortgage through these black market adoptions. The decision on William and Lila's licensure came back, and they were denied. They couldn't get a license. And Roy Davis thought that he probably thought that he won at that point. Except William and Lila didn't stop. The ads for, quote, lovely babies for adoption were still heavily running in both Canadian and American newspapers. So he decided to follow the paths and track down some of these adoptions that had been performed at the Ideal Maternity Home. New Jersey at the time had a specialized task unit that was trying to crack down on illegal adoptions and baby smuggling, which apparently was a huge issue in the 1930s and 40s between Canada and the US. The border patrols of both countries were particularly on the lookout for newborn babies going across the border. So, in order to circumvent this, the Youngs convinced the birth mothers to travel with their babies to the US to drop them off at their new homes. Of course, that was all at the mother's own expense, while they, of course, kept the full payment for selling the baby. Roy Davis and Canadian law enforcement watched their every move. Lila Young kept screaming that they were being harassed, and they were repeatedly fined for violating the Maternity Home Act. $150 in total fines. I mean, considering they were worth the equivalent of $60 million at the time, I'm sure that hurt them horribly. Law enforcement even found shallow, unmarked graves. They even found some of the Butterboxes with tiny corpses inside. But because of the state of the decomposition, they were unable to verify the cause of death. Therefore, the Youngs remained free. So in 1945, the Youngs announced that they were closing the maternity home and opening a hotel. At the same time, a newspaper from Montreal ran a huge article exposing the Youngs' entire business and the true identity of the Ideal Maternity Home. The Youngs attempted to sue for slander, but lost the case and almost all of their money in the process. In fact, they lost all of it and went bankrupt. In 1946, Ylana and William were convicted of illegally selling babies to 4 American couples. Their penalty? Not jail time. It was a whopping $428.90 fine. They sold each one of those babies for $10,000, and they still, even after being convicted of selling them, turned a profit of $39,571.10. The Youngs' 5 children ended up moving across the US and Canada. William Young died of cancer in 1962, shortly before an unknown person destroyed the Ideal home by setting it on fire. It fully went up in a blaze. Ylana Young had returned to Nova Scotia and picked up her teaching gig that she had before she met William and acted like nothing happened. She ended up passing away from leukemia in 1967 at age 70. Up until recently, there was a website online called Ideal Maternity Home Survivors.com. It's now offline. So many children were impacted by this fucked up adoption mill that there were hundreds trying to find their actual birth families. Some children were given up for adoption and their biological mothers had no idea. They thought they were dead. All of Nova Scotia's adoptions are closed. So that has been a massive hurdle for many of those who survived the facility and were adopted out. But the search goes on, and there are still multiple Facebook groups and online forums dedicated to the survivors and those who were adopted out of the Ideal Maternity Home. And that's it for this episode, guys. Have you heard of this case? It's just been stuck in my head for a couple months now. It's really, really just terrifying. And it's really hard when perpetrators of this level of evil do not get justice, do not see their day in court, get arrested, get prison time. I mean, I'll even settle for something heinous happening to them, right? But nope, they all pretty much died of old age in their 70 and 71. I guess the bright spot coming out of this is that a series of laws in both US and Canada were put on the books and put into legislation due to this particular situation with the Ideal Maternity Home. Horribly, horribly sad. But that's it for today. Again, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin. Don't forget, you can check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com. We Saw the Devil across all social media. And if you're loving the show, like this episode, want to become part of the team, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/We Saw the Devil. And if you like this episode, please titty slam that 5-star review over at iTunes. Until next crime.